right, my friends. My name is Bishop Holsonback. This is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to welcome y'all to the show. Tonight we got two special guests, Dereck Gilbert and Gary Wayne. My friends, we're gonna have a Q&A at the end of the show, so get your questions ready for Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Wayne because these two cats know Nephilim culture and they connect the dots for you. So please don't be scared to ask questions. All right. Before we get started, can we bow our heads and pray?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Father Yahweh, we offer ourselves to you to build with us and to do with us is thy will. Relieve us of the bondage of self, that we better do thy will and not our own will. And take away our difficulties, that our victories may bear witness over the people we will help today of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always, Father, and not my own. Father, there's people out there that just heard your name for the first time tonight, Yahweh, and they're questioning that name. I ask all of y'all to please take the time and check out my group called Seeking Yahweh's Word on Facebook. I post up every single morning, 15 posts, and so do others. And there's like minded people in our group. And it's called Seeking Yahweh's Word on Facebook. All right, my friends. All right, let's get this started. Mr. Wayne, we got a lot that's going on in current affairs right now.
Yeah.
You know, all the way from Ukraine to Israel. I don't know where you want to start with this, Mr. Wayne, but you could please connect the dots.
A lot of dots to connect on that. That's for sure. So, is there somewhere that you wanted to start that you want to
Well,
get
the
into it? Because I think
fig
from
tree.
the fig tree generation.
Yeah. Or you
Okay.
think we should go a little farther back than that?
Well, no, I think that's always a good place to start,
Okay.
so that we can frame things a little bit better for what might be going on today. And if people aren't familiar with the fig tree generation, then it's because it's not talked about enough, in my opinion. So, where that comes up is in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and the book of Luke. So, and they're both describing some signs within this fig tree generation for the end times. It's when the disciples go to Jesus and say, when will you be coming, and what will be the signs of your coming, and how will it sort of take place? And so he provides three overarching signs. They're all important. One is the days of Noah, which follows the fig tree generation. And there's also the fig tree generation that is just before it. And then you also have the beginning of sorrows, which is really important to understand the fig tree generation. Those, to me, are the overarching signs. So in the fig tree generation, it is identifying all of the events that is being talked about before. Um, that Jesus has just listed down a chronology of events. And so what he says is in the fig tree generation is that the heavens and earth will pass away, but this generation will not pass away. But my words will not pass away. So that generation is reserved for a specific generation of the end time. We don't know exactly how long a generation is. We could look at the book of Exodus and Leviticus and look at 40 years. We could look at the book of Psalms and it would be 70 years. You could look at Genesis 6:3 and it would be 120 years that life was set in the days of Noah. And you have to know what the start date for that countdown might be as well, which can get a little bit interesting. And a lot of people look at 1947 as the Declaration of Independence and Independence War in 1948. I tend not to look at that date. I think Israel, and particularly the Southern Kingdom, needs to be in the covenant land in the last generation. But I look at Jerusalem as being the epicenter for end time prophecy. They get control of Jerusalem in 1967. So I think that might be a better start date, but we have to be open because of how long a generation might be. And if it's 1967, then you're looking at for 70 years, events really having to happen quickly to be in the 2030s. And then if it's 120 years, it could be a ways away. Now you lap into what's being talked about within that generation, the beginning of sorrows, which is wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, pestilence, and famine. And I might also lap into there, so to speak, what Luke says with the roaring seas. It seems to be part of the same mix. And all of those catastrophes are going to be happening in the end time. I think they're contrived catastrophes. I think they're brought on by those who rule this world because they want the end time, they want the showdown, they want to bring this about, and that they will soon start to, if we are in the fig tree generation, and I think we might be, I certainly think we are, but still, I don't want to be too dogmatic on that, that these catastrophes will start to work together and they'll get stronger as they go. So that if you look at how that unfolds by the time of the seal openings, which I'm saying we're not at yet, and somewhere around the beginning of the last 7 years, you get 25% destruction. So you have these sorrows or birth pangs heating up before that and getting stronger as they go. The trumpets are 33%. The wrath poles would be 100% in the year of the Lord's wrath, unless Jesus doesn't step in, which of course he does in prophecy to prevent all flesh from being killed. So we need to understand that if we are in the fig tree generation, all four of those catastrophes, and particularly to the subject tonight, wars and rumors of wars, and what might come out of that, particularly with pestilence and famine, which are usually not far behind. Can't hear you.
And we're not hearing you, William.
My bad. Dereck, would you like to add anything to that? What Gary had to say?
Well, this is one of the interesting things about end times prophecy. It is iron sharpening iron, because for 2,000 years we've been trying to figure it out, and we don't have a firm handle on it yet. I would suggest that the seals have begun to open, and that we're through the first 5 already. The 6th and 7th are still remain to come. But be that as it may, I think that what's going on in Israel right now, anytime you get something like this happening in Israel, it is prophetically significant. The reestablishment of Israel as a sovereign nation in 1948 was the fulfillment of prophecy. And I know that there are some who would disagree with that and say, well, they're not the real Jews. Oh, okay. I think we can argue that point. The fact that the Jews returned to their land, regardless of whether they fit the definition of we Christians looking in, as non-Jews, is I think not a good starting point for the discussion here. I think we can agree that none of us are living that the way that God wants us to live, specifically, not us Christians, not us Jews, and certainly, as I wrote in my book, Bad Moon Rising, Muslims, especially those who are really giving muscle to the message that they received from Muhammad. Joe Biden this past week said that Hamas does not represent Palestinians. I have friends in Israel who would disagree very strenuously with President Biden and said, yes, Hamas does represent Palestinian Arabs. And in fact, it was a shock to many of them that the summit that was supposed to be held on Wednesday with President Biden, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Sisi of Egypt, was to include Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, because the only authority Abbas has is essentially over the building that the PA occupies in Ramallah, and Hamas basically controls everything else. In Samaria, Judea and Samaria, which is what the world calls the West Bank, I will use the term our Israeli friends use, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. So this is a spiritual, a supernatural war, and it's part of a long ongoing war that dates back to at least Genesis chapter 6. Because I would argue that the entity behind that rebellion, or the one who led that rebellion, Shemaiah, the leader of the sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, is the entity who is known to Muslims as Allah. Now, that was not the conclusion I reached when I wrote Bad Moon Rising back in 2018, but I've changed my opinion since then, which I'm bound to do on my understanding of end times prophecy too. So who knows, Gary, by next year I may be agreeing with you on the seals, but we'll see. The bottom line is this. I think we're moving into a period of history where we may see what looks like, to some, the beginning of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war. I don't think it is, because I believe that Ezekiel 38, 39 culminates with Armageddon. That is the war that ends all wars. It concludes with God saying, I am the Holy One, or the world will know that I am the Holy One in Israel. And that's the only place in the Old Testament where that particular phrase is used. Everywhere else, it's the Holy One of Israel. But at the end of Gog, Magog, just as at Armageddon, when Jesus, the rider on the white horse, the Messiah, fights for Israel on the battlefield, he is the Holy One in Israel. But there will be a war, I think, that will lead many to believe that Ezekiel 38 has begun. In fact, we've seen many of the prophetically minded rabbis in Israel, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis in particular, looking at the Syrian civil war and saying, well, that's the Gog-Magog conflict. Sadly, because I think the war that will convince them that Gog of Magog is here, which may be this conflict that appears to be escalating as we're recording this, as we're broadcasting tonight, they may, when Israel wins, as I believe they will, when Israel is victorious in this conflict, they may well welcome whoever they see as responsible for that victory as the Mashiach. And it's not going to be the guy they think. There are a number of interesting things that are connected to this conflict right now. We had a very interesting discussion with our friend Ali Siadatan, who suggests that this shows a parallel to Zechariah 14, which is the prophecy of Messiah's return, and of course that is, I believe, an Old Testament prophecy of Armageddon. Messiah returns, lands on the Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives splits in half. You go further down in Zechariah 14, and you see that the nations who survive that conflict will then travel to Israel annually to worship Yahweh and to celebrate the Feast of Trumpets, the festival called Sukkot. Well, this war that began, the sneak attack launched by Hamas on October 7th, began right at the end of Sukkot. So you've got that connection there. He also pointed out something that was very interesting. Back in 1979, the peace negotiations that took place after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, where Egypt and Syria launched a sneak attack on Yom Kippur, and again, Hamas, 50 years and 1 day later from that date, October 7th, launching its sneak attack. Not a coincidence. Muslims like to look for anniversary dates like this for these sorts of military ventures. And we'll use that term loosely because really this was not a military venture, it was a terrorist attack. That this culminated in 1979 with a peace treaty signed between Israel and the leading Arab power in the region, that is Egypt. But at the same time in 1979, you had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the Ayatollahs who took power in 1979 in Iran are now the ones who are pushing the buttons of Hezbollah to the north of Israel, Hamas to the southwest of Israel, because according to Ali, who is Persian by birth, raised in Iran, his family left the country after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, he believes that the Ayatollahs who are aging, most of them are very old, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they may see this as their last chance to prepare the way for the Mahdi, and maybe the hidden Imam will appear once they've prepared the way for the Mahdi. They also see the growing relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia as an existential threat, because the Saudis are the leading Sunni power today, Iran the leading Shia power. The Shias and the Sunnis hate one another. So you've got in 1979 with the peace treaty of Egypt, basically Arab Muslim world giving up war, because since that time there's been no real conflict with Israel since then. I mean, Saddam Hussein's few missiles during the first Gulf War notwithstanding. But now you've got the Shia Muslims who are essentially leading this conflict against Israel. So there are a lot of pieces in play here. We're seeing into that realm as through, as Paul wrote, through a glass darkly, meaning we're looking into a mirror in a darkened room. Sorry, we got some flies here in our new office building. And so we're not going to see this perfectly, but I think we're looking at something that is going to lead to a conflict that will be misinterpreted as the Gog-Magog war. And whether this blows up into the prophesied Psalm 83 conflict remains to be seen, but it's certainly possible.
Gary, would you like to?
Yeah, there's, I mean, a lot of good stuff that Dereck's talking about there for sure. I think, you know, one of the first things I agree with is that it doesn't matter whether or not you think all of the people of the Jewish people today are Jewish or not, or the true ones. What we do know is in the end time, and if we are in the end time, God will stand and fight for Israel in the Gog War. And again, he'll offer protection for Judah that's fleeing in the last 3.5 years. And then he comes and he'll have reconciled Israel and Jesus by then in time for Armageddon. So understand that the people of Judah, who, whatever you think of them, there's at least a remnant there that God remembers in his holy covenant. And he will be gathering all of his people based on the holy covenant. So let's just make sure we keep that in mind. And I'm not saying all the Jewish people are fantastic from a biblical monotheist perspective. There's a lot of polytheism in Judaism, and there's probably a lot of seculars in there. So we want to be careful with that. I also think that when we look at what's going on there today, there's a lot of history that is sort of involved in what's going to be happening again as we go through the last years. So I would certainly suggest that there are some particular nations that are going to be settled for their sins against Israel. 3 and 4 reasons in particular that are defined for each of them. And that's going to be nations like Edom. And this is the nations that are listed in Psalms 83, and including the Arab peoples there as the people who conspire to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And it includes the Philistines, which is the modern day Palestine.
Right. I mean, you look at Zephaniah chapter 2, Amos chapter 1, in Zechariah, you got a mention of Gaza as well. But in Zephaniah 2, to me, Zephaniah 2 really reads like it's a prophecy of the judgment on the lands currently occupied by Hamas.
Yeah.
And this is in the context of the day of the Lord. So this may not be an immediate reckoning, but a day of reckoning is coming.
Yep.
Where Zephaniah 2, beginning at verse 4, for Gaza shall be deserted and Ashkelon shall become a desolation. And of course, Ashkelon and Ashdod, who's mentioned in the next line, are occupied by Israelis now. But woe to you, inhabitants of the seacoast, you nation of the Kerethites. That's Crete, which is where the Philistines are believed to have originated. The word of Yahweh is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you until no inhabitant is left. And you, O sea coast, shall be pastures with meadows for shepherds and folds for flocks. So whether this happens now or later, a day is coming where that region will have a reckoning.
Absolutely. And in, like with Moab and that destruction, and Zephaniah that you're talking about, destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is something spectacular in damage. And I also look at, just from a historical sort of perspective, with that oath to wipe the Israelites from the face of the earth, that originates in the Exodus. And again, as we approach the gathering as being in the end time, you're going to have some Exodus overlays of things that we might want to look at. And in that time, it was Amalek who wanted to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And then they're the ones, after they get defeated at Rephidim, they are the ones that are going to stir up all the other nations against them continually, against Israel. And in the time of David, we get that complete sort of listing of inspiring nations in Psalms 83. But what's also interesting is that when we look at Hamas in Palestine today, and it's not all of the Philistine territory that they had. So let's say Ashkelon isn't in Gaza today. It's a little bit further north, but it's sort of similar, and it'll be probably a little bit wider at the end. You've got a people there who are part of the oath to swear Israel to wipe Israel from the earth that aren't all human. So you got the Philistines that I would argue are hybrid humans, and they're going to intermarry with some giant nations as they come back and expropriate the land about, say 100 years before the Exodus or so. And those are very interesting people that they're mixing with. You have the Cherithim, as I put an IM suffix on it. You have the Caphtorim, you have the Pelathim, and the Casualim, and they're from Crete. And this is part of the confederacy of the Philistines, intermarrying with them and then coming back to their homeland, because you have to remember they were there in the time of Abraham as well and connected with some giants back then as well. You have Abimelech, as I recall the name, which is one of those patronymic kingship titles that passes down through history.
Right.
And in that Philistine Pentapolis, you have the city that's being split into different ruling factions of that confederacy. And most people think that the Philistines drove all of the giants out of there, but they actually bring a number of them into the Philistine Confederacy, which is part of the larger, what I call the Southern Alliance of nations that are in Edom and Seir and those locations that were working together. But within that Philistine Pentapolis, you have Ashdod and Ekron, which are Philistine-run cities. Then you have Gaza, or Azza, as it's known in ancient Hebrew, which are controlled by the Avim. And then Anak is controlled by, and Gath are controlled by the Anakim. So you have this quite a mix of people, all of them sworn to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And so Hamas, whether or not they're a bloodline of that, some people suggest they might be a bloodline of Amalek, and you could certainly put some Amalekites, probably the hybrids, but could be giants in there as well, just south of Gaza, along with a couple of other tribes, just as they're located there. They're also located by Petra. They're also a pocket of them as you go towards Mesopotamia. But I don't think it's that bloodline, but it could be. But there seems to be, I guess where I'm going, like a bloodline transgenerational oath that's almost like in the DNA that they have to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. So it's very, very interesting that we see this going on. Now, Iran has that same blood oath, but they're not necessarily part of that alliance of people who swore that oath. And they're a different people than the Arabs,
Right.
just as the Arabs consider the Palestinians foreigners from Crete, even though you can make an argument in the time of Abraham, they were already there. And not an argument, a statement of fact biblically. And that's why they don't want to take them in as refugees. And in any of the countries they're in, they don't have rights because they don't consider them, to be equal to the Arab nations. So the Persians, they are part of that Gog alliance, and that Persians, that can include Iraq and a few other countries in there. You could also include India in that Persian alliance. And it's interesting that India buys most of their energy from Russia as we see this greater alliance start to show up. And so with the Indo-Aryans, the dark-haired Indo-Aryans, they settled into the Persia region of the Middle East, and could possibly be Elam or another group with Elam being very similar to them. Not Elam from the Table of Nations, but a tribe out of the Table of Nations that probably takes a name from the giants that they intermarry with. And Also, the Persians are supplying the bloodline to the Achaemenid Persian dynasty. And that goes back to sort of Greek sort of bloodlines there. And so the Indo-Aryans are known to have settled both in Persia and in the Indus Valley. So you have these two branches. In fact, they even have the same names for the same gods and same Zoroastrian religion of the Indo-Aryans that was going on that sort of spread further into towards the coast. So you have that that's starting to brew, but we don't have that full alliance together yet for that Gog War. But it's starting to form. And depending on who you think those nations are, I mean, I think Germany might be Gomer, and I think they're locked in with that same energy issue. Togarma seems to be Turkey. They seem to be struggling with the NATO alliance and are leaning towards Russia and Iran. And I think Russia is, Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, which has an etymology also back to Moscow and a whole bunch of other things that might connect them in there. That starts to form a lot of that alliance, but that's not there yet. So my advice is for people not to get ahead of biblical chronology, that think that's coming. And I think Dereck's bang on that that's coming. And this may have a lot of similarities, just as the catastrophes will have lots of similarities that will confuse people. In fact, in Revelation 6, where you have that 25% destruction at the end, you've got the kings and the princes of the earth hiding in caves because they think it's the day of the Lord. Even they think it's come sooner than what they had thought. And then we have to also enter in that, just as Dereck was talking about, you have many antichrists that are going to come, including the Mahdi. Of both the Sunni and of the Shia, they have different ones, and there may even be a showdown between them first.
Yes.
You've got Lord Maitreya or the new Buddha as another one, and Gog, as you take that back to Greek and Hebrew into the meaning, it means an end-time antichrist figure. An antichrist is going to need what I would call a counterfeit antichrist that has a counterfeit Armageddon that he takes credit for winning, so that he can come back as Jesus with Jesus's credibility, because he's going to counterfeit pretty much everything he can that's prophesied for Jesus. So this is moving everything in that direction. I think it could get vicious or it may die down, but it is going to continually boil up, because this is all about history that will happen again, because nothing is new under the sun, and what was will be again.
Yeah, we may disagree on a few particulars here and there, Gary, but I think broad strokes, I'm in complete agreement. I think what we're looking at may escalate into a broader regional conflict, and we're even seeing some hints of that tonight as we're discussing this. Apparently the U.S. Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf has intercepted a couple of missiles that were fired by the Houthi rebels, who of course are backed by Iran. These are the rebels that have taken control of the country of Yemen, the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. And apparently those missiles were headed northward towards Israel. They've got some longer range missiles that can strike deep into Saudi Arabia, but can also reach the southern part of Israel, like Eilat. So they were intercepted by our fleet in the Persian Gulf. And this is just a sign that these things may be spreading out. We also saw that with Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz visiting Israel, the deployment of German special forces to the island of Cyprus. So they're being prepared to possibly go in. President Biden, actually Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, has told about 2,000 American troops in Europe to prepare to deploy. So this could turn into a wider conflict.
Absolutely.
Which, again, and I agree with you that the Gog-Magog conflict, the legitimate one, is the one at the end of the age, with Gog as the Old Testament form of the Antichrist. But there will be another conflict that will appear to be that which will set up this false Messiah who will establish his kingdom before that final Gog-Magog conflict.
Yeah, and I think, just to give some people sort of an impression of how bad it might get. So instead of, let's say, being 25% destruction, which is one of the marking points with the seals, if you had 10% of the world's population, 10% of the whole earth wiped out, you would still have, 600 or 700 million people dead. Yeah. I mean, unlike anything we've seen before, and very much apocalyptic-like. So, you could see a number of these things sort of increasing as we go. I also think that you need these catastrophes, and in this case, wars and rumors of wars, to work to bring about the false prophets of Babylon and the coming 10 king seventh empire. That's going to need that type of chaos to come together. And so I think, like, you have some of those nations of those 10 kings, or groups of those 10 kings, part of, which is listed in Ezekiel 38 and 39, but not all of them, but just a group that are listed there of them. And so we need that to sort of come together, but nothing like facing down apocalypse for the globalists who have caused it, to have the solution ready and waiting that this is the only answer. So when you see the perpetual war people at work, we should run from them. I'm not saying we ought not to defend ourselves, and there's time to fight and time not to fight, but this endless war policy of the left and the establishment of the right, that's not who we are as Christians. That's not how things should be. And they never try, and particularly with the US, which is sort of acts like, in my opinion, the attack dog of the Europeans, who just get to sit back and wait, not trying to be hard on Americans, just the leadership and those who are in power, that you have this ongoing subsidy of wars, never to win them, never to end them, only to make sure they continue for decades. That is inhuman to do that. It's almost like they're doing ritual sacrifices, just as Hamas in polytheism, in this case, picked a special day, which is usually religiously important, as a sacrifice to the polytheist gods. They're like two ends of the same stick, and they're all pushing us in the same direction. They're cattle herding us into their utopia, which is going to turn into dystopia. Heck, even in the putting together of it, it's not utopia, it's dystopia, and it only gets worse once they put it together.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm thinking, and the reason that this conflict is so intense and ongoing, and just communication with Israeli friends who are watching this, who are politically astute and aware, and of course all of them have served in the IDF, just as because that's what you do when you're an Israeli citizen. So they've all got some a better frame of reference for what's going on than those of us on this side of the pond. As I said, they see Hamas representing the Palestinian Arabs, the Arabs who live around them. And I've got friends who live in Samaria, so they are in close contact with a lot of folks. And they've got Arab friends. We met some very nice Arab people when we were in Israel. In fact, when we were there in 2018, we were there during the celebration for Israel's 70th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence, which also coincided with President Trump moving the American Embassy to Jerusalem. We were there on the first day the sign went up, American Embassy, this way. And of course, Hamas blew things up on the Gaza border. There was a lot of rioting, protests, tires burning, and so forth. Our friends say this will never stop until we transfer, and this is a nice way of putting it, transfer all Arab Muslims out of Israel. Now, I don't know how you accomplish that without a lot of violence. I mean, it would be like the United States saying, okay, the 20 million people that we've allowed into the country illegally, they all have to go. How do you make that happen realistically? You can do it, but it won't be pretty. And I think that is, but given what's just happened in Israel with 1,300 dead Israelis at this point, most of whom are civilians, you transfer that here to the United States, they've got 9.5 million there, we've got 350 million here. I mean, they've been calling that Israel's Pearl Harbor. It's way worse in terms of percentage of the population. But I think it gets down to this long supernatural war over who controls that land. God decreed and signaled very early on, from the time of Abraham, with the binding of Isaac, on Mount Moriah, the mountain of the Amorites. This is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But this land had long been considered the territory of the Canaanite gods in particular, and the chief god of the Canaanites, the creator god, the father god, if you will, who was called El by the Canaanites, But as I found in the research of my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, he went by many different names in different cultures throughout history. He was Dagon to the Philistines and also to the Amorites who lived along the Euphrates River. He was Enlil to the Akkadians and Babylonians. He was Saturn to the Romans, Kronos to the Greeks, Baal Haman to the Phoenicians, not to be confused with Baal, the storm god, who was the king of the pantheon. But this god, the Saturn, Kronos, El, Enlil, Dagon, Milcom of the Ammonites, Molech of the Hebrews. I argued that this is the character that we know from the book of 1 Enoch as Shemaiah, who comes out of the abyss in Revelation 9 as the angel of the bottomless pit, the abyss, which is where the titans of Greek mythology are right now. This entity was the city god of of Gaza, going back at least to the time of Samson. We know that the Philistines worshiped Dagon because of the story with Samson. That temple was in Ashdod, where Dagon basically wound up bowing before the ark, falling over. But just read a paper the other day that was written about 10 years ago, that the city god of Gaza, known from the Persian period, so 6th century BC, 5th century BC, through the early Christian era, about 500 AD, was called Marnus. But a scholar named Edward Lipinski said, yeah, he was called Marnus, but Marnus is just Dagon. Okay, well, it makes sense. So you got Dagon, or El, there in the Gaza area. We know that there is a site where Jacob saw angels ascending and descending on, the word in English is ladder, but essentially it was a ziggurat is what the word really means. Ascending and descending to heaven at Bethel, which means the house of El or temple of El. El, just another name for Dagon. We know that Mount Hermon was the threshing floor or the tabernacle of El, Dagon, Molech, Kronos, etc., etc., etc. When Jeroboam split the northern tribes away from Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, he set up golden calves at Dan at the foot of Mount Hermon and at Bethel. Why did he do that? Because the main epithet of El was Bull El. This entity has wanted to control, oh yes, and by the way, Solomon was conned into or persuaded by his Ammonite wife to build a high place on the Mount of Olives, just across the valley from the Temple Mount to Milcom, Molech, for which the priests called that mount the Mount of Corruption. But when you look at the Hebrew, it's actually Har Ha Mashkith, which means Mount of the Destroyer. The destroyer, Abaddon, Apollyon, Shemaiah, Molech, it's all the same entity. He was there at Jerusalem, he was there at Bethel, he was there at Dan, he was there at Mount Hermon, he was there in the Philistine territories. I think this entity, who is now locked up in chains in the abyss, according to Peter and Jude, through his demonic minions, the spirits of the Nephilim destroyed in the flood, basically his children and the children of his colleagues, his co-conspirators, are still influencing things in the world today as they try to reclaim this land that God called his and declared his holy ground. That's what's going on today in the natural realm. When you look at geopolitics, you have to look at the theopolitics behind it.
Yeah, and the land that, Dereck was talking about at the beginning, was first sort of identified, I think, within the Eden parameters, where you have the Euphrates and the Nile as being the east-west borders, just as the
Right.
same land is outlined as you're talking about in Genesis 15. That interesting lists what I call the Mighty 10. Not only does it have the Mighty 7, but it's got the triple K. And you'll be interested in, Dereck, I take those triple K ones back through the Ugaritic text to specific tribes of the Datanu assembly that I know
Yes.
you're very, very familiar with. So
Right. That's the origin of the word. The word Titan comes from the Datanu or Tidanu, the Amorite tribe that goes back to the 3rd millennium BC.
Yeah, because you can have that pronounced as Dedan or Titan, because or interchangeably, and it's transliterated all those ways because it was pronounced that way through different sort of languages. So that's where you end up at sort of Titan, instead of being any D's in there, they're both T's. And so you have, and what's also interesting is that the Ugaritic text, outlines a lot of the nations and the tribes, and El as being the parent god of Baal, who Baal takes over for with the Baalim after the flood. I think they both end up to the abyss as well. And the other interesting that you're talking about, Shemiyaza, I agree. I think he's Abaddon Apollyon. I tend to just shorten it to Azazel. I look at Shemiyaza as being maybe a corruption in the book of Enoch. It comes from sort of, you take that back to Hebrew, I know you're aware, but just so the audience knows, Shem is being famed or infamous. And Yaza doesn't end in EL, but it is both an Arabic term and a Zen or Zoroastrian term for an angelic being. So this is a specific title of Azazel, just as most angels had a lot of titles. Maybe that's why it's spelled that way. And just as Azazel is the leader of the host in the book of Enoch, I think they're really the same angel. And you have actually part of Azazel in Shemiyaza, with the last part Aza, which is root word for Az and Azaz, which means strong and mighty, and then starts to connect into, in Hebrew, to the goat terms. And Azazel is the scapegoat in Leviticus 16 on the Day of Atonement. I'm going down a couple of rabbit holes here, but I just wanted to sort of underline that there's a lot of consistency that's coming together in the research for the end time that hopefully, not everybody's going to agree 100% with everybody, whether or not it's in the audience or on the panel or anywhere, but you try and discern for yourself so you can sort of better understand it. And then I'll add in now, as we look into that mix of nations that swore an oath to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, that's described in Psalm 83, you also have Tyr. And Tyr is part of the old commercial aspect of all of the beast empires past. And it was destroyed and rose to become that commercial entity all the way through. And it's one of the allegorical terms to the ruling Babylon of the end time, with that commercial enterprise aspect. And there are other aspects of Babylon as well, too. And Tyr is the place where Jezebel comes from.
Right.
And Jezebel is probably a connection, as we need to understand some of the female prophetesses that are coming in the end time with this old beast religion that is the mystical religion that was part of the organizational structure of all the hierarchies of the beast empires and before the flood as well. And that we have Tyr as a location that Hamas is operating in today. And again, with that sort of bloodline sort of connection, is committed to that inexplicably transgenerational oath that I think is with these people as strong as Harem Anathema was for the angels to carry it out to the end, because they're serving their godfathers. And Azazel being the chief one who's going to be coming out of the abyss, I think, or Shemiyaza, as Dereck also phrases him, and he's called both, to be honest, in the book of Enoch, that will lead Abaddon Apollyon out of the abyss that is going to start. He doesn't start the war, but immediately following that first woe is the 200 million man army. And those are the same creatures that I think that are in Joel 1 and 2. And I think might be more associated with the Gog War as well. And that this happens before the midpoint and before Antichrist takes power. So we might part on that, but I'm also open to the fact that the Gog War may not be part of that. But I look at some of the timing of it. It's got the end days in Ezekiel 38, where it's in the latter days, but it's the key one for me is it's after the burial of the people in the Gog War, you have second Exodus. And that's in the time of Jeremiah's trouble, Hebrew word Sarah, the time of trouble in Daniel 12. And Sarah is the cognate word for great tribulation, or tribulation in that application in the New Testament in Greek, which starts after the abomination. So to me, there's some more connections in there, but because the type of disaster is so similar and so powerful, and the same type of language, which is very, very similar to some other Old Testament passages and Revelations, you don't want to get too dogmatic on that, but it just looks to me that it is close to being an Armageddon, but not quite.
All right, Mr. Wayne. I want to thank y'all, Dereck and Gary, for your connecting the dots connecting the dots for us. You know, Mr. Wayne, about 6 months ago on this show, you said that we'd be invading, China would probably be invading Taiwan. Do you
No,
still?
that's not quite what I said.
Okay, all
What
right.
what have said all along is there are two times of a year where China would launch an amphibious operation, and that if I was speculating, I would suggest that they would do it before the next presidential election, so you don't have to take into the account of a strong leader that might be pushing back on a speculative basis. So he could still go this time, but I think it's a little bit too soon because things haven't progressed, let's say, as fast as what they seem like they were progressing, and the Ukraine war is still going on. It looks like this may be possibly connected as a tactic to draw down the arsenal of the Americans, get them going on two fronts, and then go in. But because Xi is so patient and they play such a long-term game, they may be looking for next April, or he may stick to his own timetable of 2027. I just find it difficult unless he somehow knows he'll have somebody like Biden back in office that he wouldn't go before. That's the point I was making.
Thank you for clarifying that.
I think it will be sooner rather than later because they can look at numbers and do the math and see that their demographics are changing and not in their
Yeah.
favor. They went too long with the one-child policy, and even the UN, which has been trying to scare us into thinking the world's overpopulated for years, says that, yeah, China's population will drop below 800 million by the end of
Wow,
this century.
that's a big drop. Yeah.
Yeah, that's about half, basically, and that means that they're getting older, which means the number of men of military age is shrinking and shrinking quickly. So if they're going to do something, they're going to do it sooner rather than
Yeah.
later.
And if people are wondering why I pick October and April, is it's going to be an amphibious invasion. So the seas are the calmest between Taiwan and China in those 2 months of the year. So from a military tactic perspective, you would go when the seas are going to be more cooperative.
Amen. You know, Dereck, do you think Putin is royalty, bloodline?
That's a question I've never really considered. I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay. How about you?
But I mean, it depends on how far back you want to go. I mean, if you really want to look at it, I descend from Celtic royalty. My I don't know how many generations back. Clúarc Hain was one of the last Welsh kings before the Anglo-Saxons came in and took Britain in the 5th century AD, 6th century AD. Sharon descends from Edward Longshanks, but you get far enough down the line, too many generations born to the third and fourth child instead of the eldest, and does it mean anything anymore? I don't think so.
All right.
Who did you ask was a bloodline? I missed that.
Putin, is he royal bloodline?
Well, he claims he is. Whether or not it's true or not, that's his claims. And there's newspaper stories in the early 2000s that take his story and his history, that he goes back to the Putin dynasty of Kiev and the Rurikid dynasty, and that he's trying to sort of reinstate that old Scythian Indo-Aryan Tsar empire. And so how you sort of get there is that, let's just do a little bit of history with the Tsars in Kiev. In about 1000 AD, they set up the Russian Moscow branch with Vladimir the Great, and it's a Putyanin dynasty. And then in about 1600, just shortly after, you get a junior offshoot through intermarriage of the Romanovs that are going to rule until, I think, the Western bloodline families create communism to get rid of a pure blood rival bloodline that they're very concerned with and aren't cooperating with them the way they want to cooperate. Now, Putin, that name comes out of nowhere in about 1850. There is no genealogical existence to the name before that in the Kiev area or even in Russia. So what's thought on that is, and again, this is sort of comes out with the information that Putin says about himself, is in other sort of information that you could set alongside, is the Putinans, they had a tradition. If you had a child out of wedlock, you wouldn't live poorly, but you wouldn't be within the family, and you wouldn't get the full name, but you would get a partial name. So it was sort of a specific thing. So that's where Putyanin seems to be, where maybe that name might have come from, because it comes out of nowhere with his grandfather or great grandfather, depending on which person of the historical aspect on this that you're talking about. So his father, Putin's father, actually moves to St. Petersburg in World War I. And that's how he ends up in Russia. So he's claiming this bloodline. That's why he has Vladimir the Great as a statue that he set up, because he's sort of trying to become that reincarnated Putyanin dynasty. And he thinks Kiev is their holy city. I don't know whether any of that's true. All I know is he seems to be acting on that belief, and that I don't think he's going to destroy Kiev, but he's going to take Ukraine, and he's not going to stop, and he's going to add back that old empire. So this is part of that sort of Tartarian kind of empire, just as the Cossacks were Tartars, part of the Scythian tribes that were settling in there. And so I don't think he's going to be expanding that into the Mongolian Empire, which were arguably from the Scythians and depicted as the Scythians and quite taller than the average ancient and with white skin in their depictions, and were expert riders like the Scythians and a whole bunch of other things, because we're not doing a show on Tartaria today. I think that probably falls into the kings of the East and the Chinese rising empire of Xi, and somehow into that mix. But I do believe he wants to be one of the 10, and he wants a larger role, just as Xi is not necessarily not wanting to have 10 kings ruling. He just wants a larger role, and Europeans don't want him to have that larger role. And that's part of that conflict that's going on. And Xi comes from the Shah dynasty, XIA for Shah, which produced all the royal dynasties coming from the dragon creator gods, both before and after the flood. And so he's from the western branch of the Shah dynasty, who's back in power now. And you could make a case, or they'll probably make a case, that he has those bloodlines as well. You have to understand that the royals, AL is a transliteration of EL, just as in Baal, kings of God, they believe their divine right to rule comes from Mount Hermon and the Baalim after the flood. I would say El before the flood from my understanding of prehistory, but from the Baalim and the assembly at Mount Hermon, they get the divine right to rule, just as King James asserted that right to rule. And so all of these bloodlines believe they are given that divine right to rule from whichever pantheon they're worshiping. In this case, the dragon creator gods, right? So just the same thing as seraphim angels or nagas or plumed serpents and feathered serpents, same type of angelic, fallen angelic hierarchy that they're getting this authority from. So I don't know whether they're all bloodline kings or there's going to be some that are and some that aren't, but Daniel 2:43 suggests there's a different kind of being involved in those 10, because they're going to mix their seed with humankind. So there's a mix of something going on there, whether it's spiritually or physically, but because you could, in Hebrew, and some of the words you could take that back as sort of being possessed, or a demon spirit possessing one of those kings, and maybe it's both. So we have to be aware of that. And then you get all of these other things like in Psalms 21, 8-10, where you have this bloodline, this fruit, this seed that's going to be removed from humankind in the time of fire and the fiery end. And then you have that terrible branch in Isaiah 25, the branch of the terrible ones. Looks like they're called terrible ones in Ezekiel, where you have these Nephilim and Rephaim spirit kings in the sides of the abyss, speaking to another Rephaim descended king named Pharaoh. And this branch is destroyed on a mountain in the end time. And all of those passages and way more sort of attest that there's something to the bloodline issue that's also attached to the bloodline oath. So in the end time, not only are they going to continue to try and wipe Israel from the face of the earth, just as Antichrist and Satan do at the midpoint of the last 7 years, at the abomination, as Revelation 12 talks about, with his scourge that the book of Isaiah talks about. But they also are going to try and eliminate anybody who follows God and Jesus and testifies for Jesus that are still here or still alive. They will take both the grafted and the root and try and wipe that from the face of the earth, because that's what they're here to do.
Amen. Do either one of y'all think England is going to play a part in this war that's going on right now? Do you think England is going to enter it?
Just in terms of support for Israel, I don't know at this point. I think that Europe in general is at least at this point backing Israel. I was surprised to see the Germans sending their special forces to Cyprus to prepare to deploy them to the Middle East. But if that happens, I think you're going to see, well, I mean, as we've seen this afternoon, Israel is essentially evacuating all of its embassies, most of its embassies in the Muslim world. Those at least that weren't beginning to normalize relations in, say the UAE and so forth. But I think this probably is going to escalate just based on what I'm seeing in the news this afternoon.
And the Prime Minister
prophetically speaking,
Prime Minister of England put his support behind Israel today.
Right.
What that means, I don't know, but he will. I think he comes in, but not with the Europeans. He would come in if the U.S. has to come in. He would go with that support. He needs to
probably,
move closer to the U.S. now that they're out of Europe, and he needs to get treaties. He needs to get the alliances set a little bit more personally for England's safety with the U.S. So he will. I think strategically they would make that move, but not in front of the U.S., but in support and behind, and would do military support in that case.
Amen. Thank you guys so much. Dereck, is there anything you would like to throw out there about your book? I was able to throw up a link, but I want you to plug your book and let people know where to go get your book, Dereck.
Well, it's available at most major bookstores, Amazon.com. Sharon and I have all of our books available at our website as well. If you like the electronic copies you read digitally on like a Kindle or whatever, you can get them at Amazon. But you can go to our bookstore as well at our store, gilberthouse.org/store. And we do a little better financially if you go through us rather than Amazon. And when you buy from us directly, we will sign the hard copies, not the digital ones, of course.
All right. How about you, Mr. Wayne? Where do people go to get your books? And can you tell more people about your new book that's coming out and when they can get it?
Sure. So the best place to go is to my website, thegenesis6conspiracy.com. And on that website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of the first book. There is now a generous excerpt of all 84 chapters, and the complete sort of chapter table of contents up there, so people can start to get a view of it. You'll see up on Amazon, you'll see the new book posted. That cover is going to be changing. It was just changed yesterday to make it a little bit more color-wise different than the first book, even though I thought there was a difference. The sales and marketing thought it needed to be more distinct so people don't confuse the book. It's got a March 12th release date, unfortunately. There's a paper shortage right now. There's a labor shortage and a printer shortage. So you have to give a date to Amazon that you can meet. And if you don't, the publisher gets punished big time by Amazon because they control over half the market. So we're hoping to have the book printed sooner. The digital copy could be available sooner because it's ready to go. You just give that over to Kindle and it makes the digital copy. So hopefully that'll be out sooner. I'm getting pricing. Pricing's up on the website right now. You cannot buy the new book from me or pre-order yet. That will be in the next week or so. I'll send everybody who sent me emails, notifications on how you can get the book. I just want to make sure we have things nailed down. I understand that there's been another 10% increase in the production costs. It's not changing the pricing I've got up there for the first book or my inventory on the first book, but I know I've got notice for my after my inventory runs out that the price is going to be going up another $3 or $4 a book. So, but I've got lots of inventory for a while. And we'll see how long that price holds on Amazon. So that's the best way to get a hold of me. We're changing the website so it's a more clear contact the author. But in the meantime, and it might even be up now, I haven't looked today, but I wanted it up this week. If you go to the media page, click on Contact Gary Wayne for an interview. That's my email address. It'll come through to me. Send the message. That's genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com. And if you wanted to get on a list for notification of how you can pre-buy from me for a signed copy, go to this email address, genesis6conspiracypart2@gmail.com. You don't have to say anything. I'll be formulating the information on the release where you can get it, the pricing, and I will give you a notification and I won't even ask for a purchase. It'll just be a notification of the price and how you can get a hold of the book or how you can pre-order.
Dereck, how many books have you written?
Well, let's see. I lost track. Let's see. Great Inception, co-authored The Day the Earth Stands Still with Josh Peck. Last Clash of the Titans, Bad Moon Rising. Second Coming of Saturn. Then the two I co-authored with Sharon, Veneration and Giants, Gods, and Dragons. And then 2 novels. So I guess that would be 9.
All right. I just know that y'all have written a lot of books, and I wanted people to know that there's a lot of books out there from Dereck Gilbert.
Well, we're working
All
on
right,
another
my
one we
friend.
hope to have out in the spring. So we're working on one under the title Sharon and Me called The Gates of Hell.
Gates of Hell. Can I ask you, both of y'all this question? Are we in end times right now?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Think so? I think so too. All right, my friends. My name is Bishop Holsonback, and I want to thank all of y'all that's tuned in on the Facebook group. I'll have to re-upload this video into YouTube because YouTube has blocked me from going live. And they just did that in between the show. We was broadcasting into YouTube, and then halfway through it, they blocked us out. That's fine. I can re-upload and put it to you for you YouTube guys. But I want to thank everybody from the Facebook group and my timeline for tuning in, and may Yahweh bless you all. Thank you.